Middle-earth is an ancient realm where the struggle between light and dark has shaped the very bones of the earth. From the creation of the world to the rise of kingdoms and the fall of mighty civilizations, its history is written in the blood and tears of its inhabitants. There is, however, a darker thread woven through this tapestry, a shadow that has remained hidden for millennia. This is the story of that shadow, the tale of a betrayal that would set in motion forces more powerful and dangerous than anyone could have imagined. It begins with Sauron, the Dark Lord, whose name would become synonymous with terror. But long before Sauron's rise to power, he was not a being of darkness. He was known as Mehron, a Maya, one of the lesser Aenir, whose talent for craftsmanship and wisdom shone brightly in the light of the Valar. Mehron was a servant of Alle, the Vala of creation, and his skill in shaping the world was unmatched. He was revered by his peers, respected by the mighty, and his future seemed filled with promise. Yet beneath his brilliance, Mehron was not content with the world as it was. He longed for greater order, for the world to be shaped according to his vision. This desire, a thirst for control and perfection, would lead him down a path from which there would be no return. For it was during this time that Mehron met Morgoth, the most powerful and most malevolent of the Valar. Morgoth, once known as Melkor, had fallen far from grace, consumed by pride and envy. Seeing the potential in Mehron, he seduced him with promises of absolute power, of dominion over all creation. Morgoth spoke of order, of the world reshaped according to their will, and Mehron, ever the seeker of control, was drawn to these promises. This was the moment of Sauron's first betrayal. Mehron swore an oath to Morgoth, binding himself to the dark force that sought to unmake the world. And in that vow, Mehron became Sauron, the servant of darkness. This was no ordinary betrayal. It was a surrender of the very soul, a corruption that would slowly, but inevitably, seep into every corner of Middle-earth. Gandalf, wise in the ways of ancient knowledge, began to uncover this dark history as he delved into the past. His investigation took him deep into the ancient texts, where he uncovered the truth of Sauron's fall from grace. Through discussions with Elrond and Galadriel, Gandalf pieced together the story of the Maya who had once sought only to bring order, and who had become a tool of chaos. The deeper Gandalf dug, the more he realized that this betrayal was not a singular event. It was part of a slow, deliberate corruption that stretched over millennia, beginning with the oath Sauron made to Morgoth. The oath itself was not simply a promise made in a moment of weakness. It was an ancient pact forged in the darkest of intentions, one that would shape the future of Middle-earth. The first betrayal marked the beginning of Sauron's transformation from a Maya of great potential to the Dark Lord, whose very name would send shivers through the hearts of the free peoples. It was the birth of the evil that would shape Middle-earth for ages to come. Gandalf, troubled by the weight of his discovery, now understood the true nature of Sauron's rise to power. His fall was not an accident. It was a calculated move, a manipulation of his own desires and ambitions. Morgoth had not simply corrupted him, he had shaped Sauron's very purpose, twisted it, and turned it into a weapon that would continue to poison the world long after his own defeat. As Gandalf pieced together these ancient truths, he knew that this story, the story of Sauron's first betrayal, was not just a lesson in the corrupting power of evil. It was a warning. The forces that had shaped Sauron's rise were still present in Middle-earth. Morgoth's influence lingered, and the shadows of the past were never truly gone. They merely waited for the right moment to strike again. In the beginning, Sauron's name was Mehron, a Maya, one of the lesser Aenir created to help shape the world. Born from the thought of Alle, the master craftsman of Arda, Mehron's talent was evident from the beginning. His skills in shaping stone, metal, and craft were unmatched, and his work brought wonder and praise from all who saw it. Alle, the Vala, saw in Mehron the potential for great things. But Mehron was not content to simply craft the world, he sought to control it. He saw the disarray of Arda, the imperfections that had arisen since the beginning of time, and he believed that order and perfection could only be achieved through control. At first, his ambition was not evil. He sought only to bring order and clarity to the world, to make it a place of harmony. But in time, this desire for order grew, feeding on itself. It became an obsession, a hunger for power that could not be satisfied. Mehron's desire to shape the world did not rest in mere craftsmanship. It was an overwhelming drive to bring everything under his control. It was then that Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, took notice. Morgoth, once known as Melkor, was the most powerful of the Aenir. But his pride and envy led to his corruption, and he was cast out by the Valar after he sought to dominate and destroy all that was good in Middle-earth. Yet Morgoth's power remained, and his malevolent influence still spread across the world. He sought allies, and Mehron, whose desire for order mirrored Morgoth's own twisted vision, became the perfect candidate. Morgoth seduced Mehron with promises of greater power, of dominion over all things. Morgoth painted a picture of a world where chaos was eradicated, where everything would be perfect under their control. Mehron, ever the seeker of order, was drawn to these promises. Morgoth's promises were too tempting, and Mehron swore an oath to him, binding himself to the Dark Lord's will. It was a vow that would define the course of Middle-earth's history. Mehron's fall was not a sudden moment of corruption. It was a slow process, a gradual descent into darkness. The oath to Morgoth was the first step, and with that oath, Mehron ceased to be just a Maya. He became Sauron, the servant of darkness, bound forever to the forces that sought to unmake the world. The corruption that began with Morgoth would now take root in Sauron's heart, and the world would soon feel the consequences. As Gandalf pieced this history together, he understood that Sauron's rise was no accident. It was part of a larger design, a plan set into motion by Morgoth long before Sauron's own desire for power had even fully formed. The corruption of Sauron was not an isolated event. It was a chain reaction, a link in the long legacy of evil that Morgoth had set in motion. The journey that Gandalf now faced was more than just an exploration of Sauron's past. It was a quest to understand the nature of corruption itself. What made Mehron fall? What caused him to turn his back on the very Valar who had created him? And most importantly, what did this first betrayal reveal about the power of the Palantir and the danger of wielding such knowledge? Gandalf knew that this path of discovery was fraught with danger. The darkness Sauron had embraced was not just a force of evil, it was a force of manipulation, of control, and of fear. And now, as Gandalf looked deeper into the history of the Palantir and the betrayal of Sauron, he knew that the answers he sought were not just academic, they were vital to understanding the future of Middle-earth itself. Sauron's first betrayal had set the stage for all that was to come. The Palantir, once a tool of wisdom, were now instruments of manipulation. What had started as a simple oath had spiraled into a conflict that would define the fate of the world. Gandalf's journey was far from over, but with each new discovery, he knew that the answers he sought could not come soon enough. For in the dark history of Sauron's rise, there were truths that were better left undiscovered. But Gandalf had no choice, he had to face them. And in doing so, he would uncover the terrible cost of knowledge, the price of betrayal, and the lasting legacy of Morgoth's evil. As Gandalf continued his investigation into the Palantir, the shadows of history deepened around him. What had once been a tool of wisdom, crafted with care and foresight by the elves to aid the rulers of Middle-earth, now seemed to be the instrument of a deeper, more insidious power. Gandalf had learned that the Palantir were not just objects of knowledge but powerful conduits for corruption. This revelation troubled him, for the Palantir had been entrusted to the kings of Númenor, a great and proud kingdom. These stones were meant to guide the Númenorians, to help them rule with wisdom and unity, offering them visions of the future. But it was clear now that the Palantir had not been the benign gifts they had once seemed to be. They had become something else entirely. The Palantir began to show not just the future, but the deepest desires of those who gazed into them. Visions of immortality, endless power, and the defiance of the Valar, these were the fruits that the Palantir bore. They did not lead their users to wisdom, they led them to ruin. And in Númenor, where the stones were revered, their power slowly twisted the hearts of kings and rulers. The rulers who had once been proud and noble were now consumed by the very desires the Palantir had shown them. They saw only themselves, their kingdoms, and their immortality. What had begun as a tool of foresight had become a weapon of manipulation. As Gandalf dug deeper into this history, he found Sauron's shadow looming larger and larger over the Númenorian kings. Sauron, who had already begun to extend his influence over the kingdom, saw the opportunity the Palantir presented. He manipulated the kings through their desires, feeding their ambition, their fears, and their lust for power. With subtlety and cunning, Sauron bent the rulers to his will, using the stones to show them only what they wanted to see. Through the Palantir, he planted the seeds of their destruction. Gandalf's fear grew with each passing day. The stones were not mere passive objects, they had become agents of control. In the hands of Sauron, they had served as tools of manipulation, sowing division and corruption throughout Numenor. But Gandalf knew that the consequences of the Palantir's influence stretched far beyond Numenor. The very fabric of Middle-earth's kingdoms had been shaped by the power of these stones. What had happened in Numenor was only the beginning. The reach of the Palantir, twisted by Sauron, extended further still. And then the realization dawned on Gandalf. The Palantir were not just tools, they were vessels of an ancient evil. They were tied to Morgoth, the first Dark Lord whose spirit still lingered, influencing everything they touched. The power of the Palantir, forged in the light, had been corrupted in the darkness. Morgoth's influence had never truly left Middle-earth. It had only slept, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to rise again. And the Palantir had been the vessel for that dark power, allowing Morgoth's evil to corrupt the very minds of the rulers of Middle-earth. As Gandalf pieced together this grim picture, his fear turned to dread. The Palantir had been corrupted long before Sauron's rise. They were the legacy of Morgoth himself, and even in the hands of those who sought wisdom, they had only brought darkness. The stones had been used by Sauron to manipulate Numenor's rulers, to turn them against their own people and lead them to their destruction. But the corruption did not end there. The very stones that had shaped Numenor's fall were the same ones that had corrupted Saruman, the same ones that would one day be used by Denethor, and even later by Sauron himself. Gandalf began to see the terrible truth. The Palantir were not just tools of wisdom, they were weapons of evil, forged by Morgoth and wielded by those who sought to dominate Middle-earth. They had been at the heart of Sauron's first betrayal, and now they were poised to influence the world once again. The journey that had begun with a simple investigation into the Palantir had now led Gandalf to the heart of the mystery. The very stones that had once been symbols of wisdom and clarity had been twisted by the dark powers of Morgoth, shaping the fate of Middle-earth in ways no one had ever imagined. The Palantir were not just instruments, they were active agents of corruption, capable of turning even the most noble rulers into pawns of darkness. Gandalf, feeling the weight of his discoveries, knew that the true danger of the Palantir lay not just in their power to reveal the future, but in their ability to manipulate the hearts and minds of those who sought their knowledge. The Palantir, once crafted to help the wise, had instead become conduits of power, a means for the dark forces of Middle-earth to control and manipulate. And so, with his mind heavy with these revelations, Gandalf's journey led him deeper still into the mystery. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that the Palantir were not just relics of an ancient past, they were still active, still waiting to be used. They were still tools of power, and Sauron, ever the manipulator, would stop at nothing to use them to his advantage. Gandalf's fear grew as he realized that the history he had uncovered was not just the past, it was a warning. The Palantir, once used by Morgoth and Sauron to shape the world, were not just relics of an ancient age, they were part of a much larger, much darker design. And that design, Gandalf feared, was far from finished. The shadow of Morgoth, though shattered, still loomed large over the world. The Palantir were not mere objects, they were symbols of the darkness that had shaped Middle-earth's fate. And now, as the forces of darkness gathered once again, the danger of the Palantir had only grown more pressing. The journey was far from over. What Gandalf had learned was only the beginning. The true cost of wisdom, of knowledge, was only beginning to unfold. And the shadow that had once been Morgoth's would not fade so easily. It would rise again in the hearts and minds of those who sought power through the Palantir, just as it had before. Gandalf had seen the past, but the future was yet to be written. The air in Moria felt heavier as the Fellowship made their way back toward the surface. Their bodies were tired, their faces drawn, but the true weight they carried was not of physical fatigue. It was the burden of the knowledge they had uncovered deep in the ancient halls, knowledge that had shaken them all to their very core. Gandalf's thoughts were clouded as he walked in silence, the events of the past days haunting him. The Palantir, once the beacon of wisdom for the kings of Middle-earth, now stood revealed for what they truly were: instruments of corruption, vessels for Morgoth's lingering malice. The realization had come in a rush, a flood of disturbing visions that Gandalf could not shake, no matter how hard he tried to focus on the task at hand. The Palantir were not merely tools for foresight, they were tools for domination. And the shadow of Morgoth still clung to them, unseen yet ever present, waiting for the right moment to rise again. Despite the stone being left behind, the lingering influence of its dark power clung to Gandalf, casting a shadow over his every thought. He was no longer just fighting Sauron's forces. The Fellowship was up against something far older, something more insidious. The Fellowship, bound by a common cause, was fractured by the knowledge of the darkness that lay not just in the world, but in the very hearts of those who sought to wield power. The very thing they were fighting was not just an external force, it was an internal one. The desire for power, the need to control, to see beyond what was meant to be seen. The Palantir had corrupted Númenor, led its kings down a dark path, and now their influence had seeped into the hearts of those who thought themselves wise. Frodo, who had once believed their quest was simple, was no longer the same. His eyes, too, held a new weight, and the Fellowship could feel the distance growing between them, the subtle tension that arose from the knowledge they carried. Aragorn, the reluctant king, was no stranger to burdens, but now the weight of the crown felt heavier on his brow. Even Legolas, the keen-eyed elf, looked out into the darkened halls with a new wariness. The shadows of Moria were no longer just cold and empty. They had come to symbolize the dark knowledge that they had uncovered, knowledge that had been buried for a reason. As they emerged from the depths of Moria into the relative safety of the wilderness, Gandalf could feel a gnawing sense of dread. The Palantir's influence had not been destroyed. It had only been set aside for now, hidden, but not gone. The Fellowship had left Moria, but the darkness remained, a lingering presence, ready to strike when the time was right. And Sauron, that great deceiver, would surely seek the stones again. He would stop at nothing to use their power to his advantage. Gandalf's heart grew heavy as he realized the enormity of what they faced. The battle they had started was not just against Sauron's forces, it was against the very forces that had shaped Middle-earth's fate for millennia. They had uncovered only the surface of the corruption. The Palantir had been used for far darker purposes than anyone had imagined. It was not just Sauron who sought them out, it was Morgoth's influence, the very shadow that had started it all, that still loomed over the world. The long-forgotten oaths, the manipulation, the ancient power that had twisted the hearts of kings, it was all part of a much larger, much darker plan. Gandalf had felt it within the stone, a malevolent force more ancient and powerful than Sauron himself. And as he reflected on Númenor's fall and the rise of Sauron, he began to connect the dots. Every fall of power, every corruption of wisdom had been tied to the Palantir. Even Saruman, that once wise wizard, had been seduced by the stones. He, too, had been corrupted by the visions, the promise of dominion that the stones had shown him. And now, with the stone left behind in Moria, Gandalf knew the danger had not been eradicated. It was merely waiting. The power of the Palantir had spread, and Middle-earth was left to grapple with the consequences. The knowledge that Sauron, too, would seek the stones again weighed heavily on Gandalf. Their journey was not over. They were only at the beginning of a battle that spanned centuries, one that had roots deep within the ancient past. The stones would play a crucial role in the coming war, and the Fellowship would have to face the reality that the Palantir were not just tools. They were instruments of domination, and Sauron's desire to possess them would bring the shadow back into the world. Gandalf's thoughts turned to the future. The Palantir were not gone. They were still out there, waiting to be claimed by those who sought power, and Sauron, as ever, would stop at nothing to use them to his advantage. The knowledge they had uncovered was both a blessing and a curse. It had unveiled a terrible truth about the power that had once ruled Middle-earth, but it had also revealed the scale of the darkness they faced. The Fellowship was not just a group of adventurers bound for a single purpose. They were part of a much larger, much older struggle. And this struggle, Gandalf realized, was not just about defeating Sauron. It was about preventing the dark forces of the past from returning to dominate Middle-earth once more. The Fellowship's battle was far from over. The shadows had merely begun to stir, and the Palantir, those ancient stones of power, were the key to it all. Gandalf sat in quiet reflection, contemplating the path ahead. The knowledge of the Palantir weighed heavily on him, and he understood that the journey the Fellowship had begun was far from a mere adventure. It was a fight for the very soul of Middle-earth. And it was a fight that had been set into motion long before Sauron had ever made his first move. As he gazed into the distance, his thoughts turned to the looming shadow of Sauron, whose eyes would inevitably turn toward the Palantir once more. The dark power was never truly gone. It only waited, patient and ever watchful for the right moment to strike again. And Gandalf knew that it was only a matter of time before the darkness rose once more. But there was hope. The light of the free peoples of Middle-earth had not been extinguished. The journey ahead would be fraught with danger and uncertainty, but it was a journey worth taking. The knowledge of the past was the key to the future, and Gandalf knew that, though the road was dark, there was still a glimmer of light.